So I know you were hoping when you drove over today that Pastor Matt was going to really let you have it with a 30-minute sermon on divorce. I don't think I'm starting on that foot, but there's a lot of things about this text that I think, particularly as Lutherans, it's good for us to start with for a minute, is that sometimes when we read in the text that Jesus is commanding us to do something, telling us, don't do that, put that down, be like this, that as Lutherans, sometimes we kind of let that roll off like water off a duck's back, saying, hey, we're all about grace, not quite so sure about that. And in my experience, when we read passages that are difficult for us to read, that it's sometimes just good to sit with it for a minute and kind of discern maybe what learning is in that for us. Because I think our image of Jesus is often of him sitting with children and lambs. Never with even adult sheep. This kind of like just very gracious, calm, kind of like your favorite kindergarten teacher, right? And so whenever we have an image of Jesus where he's coming out and say, okay, clowns, have a seat. I've got a word for you. We kind of get uncomfortable. When we look at the earlier texts as well, particularly the Old Testament reading, we have a similar parallel. The first reading and the gospel are often paired very deliberately with close similarities and themes. And you'll maybe didn't sense the tension in that text, but when we read the Old Testament reading where it says, choose life or choose death, that's what you get. But how many of us have been to a funeral in our lives where we're like, this person didn't choose this? We read the news, we experience it personally and say, this was not a choice. Certainly there are things about our health that are impacted by our choices, but even that is a way too simplistic way to look at these issues. And yet the text today seems to think it's like choosing whether you want an apple or a banana. It's not like that. We know as human beings that there is a brokenness inside of us and challenges that prevent us from being perfectly rational. But human beings are not computers. We're not. We're not our cell phones. We are full of emotions and passions and thoughts and ideas, and it doesn't always work that way. And so when we experience a text that doesn't allow for that understanding of humankind, where things fall out in ways that are not perfect, that are broken, we need to find a way to grace in that passage. Now, this is exemplified by the Paul reading that we have today. The Corinthians were a train wreck. It's kind of couched in the language of Paul in the first century Greek there, where he says, it's like you're a child. He says, but basically he said, you guys are the worst. Grow up. I need you to be like this, and you're just behaving like the worst in children, and it's awful. Stop doing that. But then he talks about this tension. What they're dealing with is this idea that if they follow one missionary's voice as over and against another missionary's voice, that somehow they are better Christians than the others. Now, certainly in the United States and throughout all of history, there is a pecking order amongst Christians, curiously made by themselves always, as to who the best Christians are. And when we look at this text, Paul slaps that down and says, no, we're all working together towards this. But one of the things in our modern society, and perhaps throughout history, is this image of Christianity that the more serious it is, the less about grace it is. The more it is about judgment. The more it is about following the law of the Old Testament. The less grace, the less mercy, the less forgiveness. When we read the Gospels, as a Lutheran, it would be easy to say, hey, Jesus is about grace and mercy and love. And then we get the text that we have for today, and it feels like, oh, ouch. We don't like it when Jesus talks that way. You might have noticed in the first hymn, Tim always does a great job picking the hymns, but today in particular, this idea of reconciliation, be reconciled to one another. If I were to put a layer of grace and a sense of the humankind connection on this gospel reading, it is this image of reconciliation. Reconciliation, perhaps in our most intimate and important relationships, recognizing that sometimes the brokenness of this life does not always lead to reconciliation, but an understanding that when God calls us to be in relationship with one another and with God's self, this is something that isn't just a one and done sort of thing, but something rather that takes daily action, daily prayer, daily thought, daily love. Now, this morning, it's a reminder to us as well that it's something that we do within the rhythm and pattern of our very worship together. So when we gather, not every Sunday, but today we did, and often, we gather with confession and forgiveness. The goal of that being articulated verbally is a recognition that we're not flawless, that we make mistakes, that we go to bed and wake up with a list of things we want to do better, but somehow always struggle to do. Most of us are not looking at our own face in the mirror in the evening, brushing our teeth, and said, nailed it, another flawless day by yours truly. We struggle, right? And we know that that struggle impacts those around us, particularly those closest to us. When we gather, we begin with confession. The purpose of that is to understand reconciliation between ourselves and God. So the very beginning of our time is about reconciliation with God. Now, one of the things that often happens in human life is when we gather together for bigger meals, Thanksgiving or, gosh, today a Super Bowl. I mean, a meal is probably overstating that, but at any rate, the idea of gathering with family and friends, but sometimes those are stressful times, right? Sometimes being together with family is difficult and not easy. And this text reminds us as we move through our worship service from reconciliation with God, as we begin to approach Holy Communion, we share the peace. It's kind of a little liturgical moment. It's perhaps a token of the wider work that Christ is calling us to in the text today, that we reconcile with one another, as we have reconciled with God. There have been times in the life of the church where this has been the image of the cross, right? Our relationship with God reconciled and our relationship with one another reconciled. So that when we come forward and approach the table to share in communion together and with God, we have been fully reconciled. At the end of the service, we walk out, not always, but often with the words, "Go in peace, serve the Lord, thanks be to God," as we leave. But this reconciling work that we have modeled in liturgy during our time together in worship is what we are called to be about all throughout the week. So why do we come back next Sunday? Because we won't have nailed it. And we need to boost each other and encourage one another and sit before God and say, I tried, I need to give it another go this week. It's good to be at your table so that I might be strengthened to go out and continue this work. In some ways, in the brokenness of humankind, this is our eternal work. And we recognize that work and its need in the brokenness of our relationships, the brokenness of relationships near to us, or even geopolitical and everything in between, how we treat one another. So if there is a word that we would have for today's text, or a command from Christ, it would be to be reconciled. Be reconciled to God, be reconciled to one another. And a reminder as well that when we do that work, we are right in the thick of Christ's work in this world. Amen.